Mankind stands on the edge of a precipice. Or to put it another way, we're all going to hell in a handcart. ISIS, North Korea, Russia, Trump! Yeah, we've always been going to hell in a handcart. Are we there yet? No, and that's because history probably isn't linear. There is no end game that we're aiming for. And anyway, compare now with previous periods of history, the Black Death, 1914, 1941.
I dread to think of when the wind blows.
Globally, women's death in childbirth, down.
When the wind blows.
Infant mortality, down.
When the wind blows.
Rates of polio, malaria, and many other diseases, down.
When the wind blows.
Global rates of poverty, down. Global education levels, up. Longevity, up. In more and more places, you can turn on the tap and clean water comes out. It's a miracle. And the rapid growth of young democracies. But wait, the spread of democracy in the latter half of the 20th century is one of the reasons why things have only got better. But since the financial crash of 2008 and the subsequent difficulties, there seems to be a feeling in the air, even in the Western countries, that perhaps capitalism and liberal democracy is not the answer to the question how to live. Are you nuts? Of course it's the answer. To those who complain about living standards now, sure, we need to do better. But relative to the last 10,000 years, we've never had it so good. Which is why, in this age of uncertainty, with the new nuclear threat, cyber warfare, terrorism, austerity, when populists from the right and left are telling us they have the answers, we need to remind ourselves that democracy is a fragile flower. It needs protecting, nurturing, not ripping up. It's possible we are now in the most dangerous period since the end of the Cold War, but things have been worse, and that's why it's worth remembering. Extremes are easy. It's the centre that's hard.
And Jim Marshall has made his way from Queen Elizabeth Park to us. Welcome back to the programme.
Great Halsman, thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Just be careful to say everything I tell you. Michael, has the world become, in recent years, a more dangerous place?
It depends what you mean by more recent years. I mean, I thought all the things that Tim said about all the improvements in the world are absolutely right. I do think that democracy is linked with a number of those things, and certainly capitalism is linked with a number of those things. I think what we're not really very aware of is that democracy is quite a modern experiment. In 1941 there were 11 democracies, there are now about 100, maybe 105, which means obviously that most of them are very young indeed. And we haven't really seen them in operation for long enough to know how they'll survive. I mean, actually, I think the greatest threat to democracy is that it causes competing politicians to overpromise and therefore to burden their states with debt. And I think we haven't yet seen the resolution of that issue. And indeed, you know, in our own country, we're at a state now where both our main parties are talking about certainly not reducing debt and probably increasing debt. And if democracy goes on like that, then I think it's going to find itself in difficulty. And then many of the great benefits that we've been talking about would also be in jeopardy.
The world felt a dangerous place during the Cold War, sometimes very dangerous, as in the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Berlin Wall fell, it seemed a safer place. But what I meant by recent years was perhaps in the past 10, 15 years, as it began to feel more dangerous again.
No, I think Tim's right. In comparison, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember the Cold War. I remember the turmoil and the constant fear. Now, in a way, North Korea is kind of, but there's not a lot of, I don't think there's much chance of North Korea actually launching a nuclear missile attack. But there is a feeling that with Trump at the helm in America and with Europe now, after Brexit, a little less sure of its future, that has created a problem, which will no doubt be reflected in the G20 today. But I think the biggest change, and Tim referred to it there, is since the global financial crash, there is a feeling that capitalism has become more rapacious, that it's less willing to share out its proceeds, that there are greater inequalities. There's a feeling there right across capitalist liberal democracies. It's receding a bit, and the threat of Marie Le Pen and the Wilders in Holland receded, but it's still there, and I think that needs to be addressed. But no, I think Tim is absolutely right. We are too reluctant sometimes to actually record the huge advances that we've made.
But the most recent years don't show a growth of democracy. The most recent years are characterized by a rise in authoritarianism.
Yes.
The Russian democratic experiment is over. We have an authoritarian in the Kremlin. The Turkish democratic experiment is coming to an end. We have Mr. Erdogan in Ankara. The rise of China onto the world stage as the second, or in some measures the biggest economy, is an authoritarian economy. There, the rise of the Gulf powers, authoritarian states. That's making the world a more dangerous place.
Yes, but the point of the argument was to look at things in the round and realise that the world is not going to hell in a handcart. But the second part of the argument is that to recognise that what we have and have achieved and why we've achieved it does need protecting, precisely because, as you're quite right, in the last 10 years, things they're drifting in this age of uncertainty, and there's a number of things going on. For once in my life, I disagree with Alan. Le Pen doubled the vote that her father got 15 years ago. I don't call that a failure. Wilders became second in the Netherlands election.
And the Social Democrats were destroyed.
And all that is continuing to be on the rise, which is precisely why I end the argument by saying in this time of increased nationalism and instability, the answers are not with the extremes. History has taught us, in these uncertain times, people reach for the extremes and then the house falls in. This is not a time to go to the extremes.
So these new authoritarian countries, the rise of this, which I think does make the world a more dangerous place now, maybe not as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis or times like that, or the Berlin airlift, but it still makes it more dangerous. These are not kind of banana republic, tin pot general authoritarian states. These are run by people who actually believe, the Chinese, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, Mr. Putin, they believe their way of doing things is better than democracy.
During the period when the Soviet Union existed, it appeared that democracy and capitalism were virtually the same thing. They went hand in hand. In fact, they're not the same thing at all, and they're almost in a way opposites, because democracy is all about equality and capitalism is all about inequality. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this oddity, I think, is much more visible. I mean, I think Alan is right. There is more inequality within capitalism. The people at the bottom, I think, are much better off than they used to be, but the people at the top are even richer than they used to be. And so when you go to countries like Turkey or Russia and give them a choice, well, maybe they're not given a choice, but at least it is arguable by their leaders that the choice that they might feel they wanted to make of democracy is not the best choice for them, because it's accompanied by things like inequality and poverty and so on. And so I think, capitalism and democracy together are no longer the obvious and natural choice for countries outside the European and American orbit.
If you look at the success of the authoritarians recently, Mr. Putin's largely got his way in what he calls the near abroad. He's got a new satellite state in Syria. He's got his warm water port. The Chinese have become one of the world's two most dominant economies. Turkey is playing a bigger role in the Middle East than ever. That makes life more dangerous.
Well, I have to say, when it comes to North Korea, for instance, Russia and China sound like the grown-ups. When they are saying, look, the way to resolve this is through diplomacy and through engagement and using the
Americans have been trying that for years. Clinton tried that. Obama tried that.
But what you've got a president in the US who is tweeting all kinds of things. I don't know what he's saying now, but he's always kind of up in the ante. And in that sense, as on many occasions in relation to Syria, it's China and Russia that seem like the grown-ups in the room.
Well,
and China's very different to the China we remember they now own Volvo, which just decided to make all their cars electric from 2019. Well, it's owned by Chinese. They, so they're, in the sense of their desire for stability in the West, they've moved from the Little Red Book and Mao Zedong to a situation where they're engaging.
One of the stars on the Chinese flag is to symbolise the patriotic capitalists. There's 4 stars, 4 categories of people. Very far-sighted with the communists, because there's now 1.4 billion patriotic capitalists. The interesting thing about China is that it is proving wrong the theory that you need liberal democracy to have a successful economy. That's quite dangerous. I mean, I happen to believe in liberal democracy, not just democracy, but liberal democracy. And I've been reading stuff around in our zeitgeist recently, which is saying, no, these are extreme times, we do need extreme measures. It always goes wrong. As for North Korea, I think Mr. Trump has boxed himself in. He's saying he hasn't got a red line. Do you remember the tweet when they said, we're going to build an ICBM? He tweeted, not going to happen.
Yeah.
Has happened. Mattis, his defence secretary, has said unacceptable. You now argue, well, what if it's not acceptable? What are you going to do about it? And if we have time, Andrew, what they're going to do about it is first and foremost go to the United Nations. They've already drafted a resolution. You guys know how this stuff works. The resolution calls it an ICBM. Russia's wriggle room is to say we don't think it is an ICBM, therefore we're not going to go for it. So they're going to ask them to redraft it. The Americans will redraft this resolution and they'll probably table it. They've warned publicly, the Russians, if you veto it, we will take unilateral action, which leaves in the air that if it goes through, Mr. Trump can say, you see, I did do something about it. I've got these great sanctions. I've been strong. If it doesn't go through and it's vetoed, he's then left with unilateral action. Doesn't have to mean military action, but it could do, and that is incredibly dangerous.
Dangerous.
Well, I think it is dangerous, but it just reminds me that as part and parcel of what's been happening to democracies, one of the things we used to say about 15 or 20 years ago was that democracies didn't go to war. But of course, recently they have. You know,
not with each other, but yes.
Not with each other, that's perfectly true. But, you know, the United States and Britain and other democracies have actually again and again engaged in military conflict. So I think, you know, that is another reason why people have felt this loss of confidence in democratic institutions.
I mean, you've got a loss of confidence in America, partly because of the Trump administration, but its focus is also moving from the Western Hemisphere to the Pacific Hemisphere, where it regards the rise of China as the 21st century challenge. Europe is in no position to fill the vacuum in Europe left behind by the Americans. The Russians wish to recreate their near abroad. They've got a grip in the Middle East now, which is also still in a certain chaos. There's a standoff between the Saudis and the Sunni Qataris as well, which is going to get worse before it gets better. It's not like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there's a lot that can go wrong.
Well, it feels pretty dangerous out there, and some of the argument about we're all going to hell in a handcart is because in the prism of looking at things from the last 10 years and discounting all those advances made. I mean, Tim mentioned about malaria and diseases and clean water. All of that is never reported, but huge advances, and they're great advances for civilization. I think actually, so go on, Tim.
No, I was just making sure I had time to finish. Because to play into the whole thing, what I think is happening is that the Second World War order had pretty much a dual polar world, Russia and America, and then we had a unipolar world, the United
Americas,
States.
the hyperpuissance, as
the French said. But that is now no longer the case, and the Russians and the Chinese, amongst others, will not accept a unipolar world. Turkey won't accept a unipolar world. Iran won't. And so the structure of the Western dominance is being absolutely challenged, and therefore the structure is shaking. Now, we don't know exactly what's going on, but that's why it's shaking, and we are in the middle of the structures being shaken, whether it's the World Bank being challenged by the Shanghai Bank, the Chinese banks, or whether it's NATO wondering what it's going to do. The whole thing is shaking. It's why it is a dangerous time. But I will end on a positive note, if you've had enough of me, dear leader.
Quick point.
Which is
firing squad awaits.
That, you know, bear in mind the positives. Yes, for individual people and individual things are pretty bad. But overall, I think it's harmful to us to think of the societies that we've created are actually terrible. It's never been as bad as this. It's pretty good relative
to work.
But at a
through.
time of foreign policy challenges, we have someone in the White House who knows nothing about foreign policy. We have someone in 10 Downing Street who knows nothing about foreign policy. And we even have someone in the Elysee Palace who knows nothing about foreign policy.
Happy days.
We've got to talk about someone in the Foreign Office, but
Well, I wasn't
leave
going
that
to go
aside.
that far. Tim, it's always great to see
God
you.
bless you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.